will be recorded and we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. You can either put them in the chat or wait and ask them for yourself when I open it up for questions and discussion. If you need continuing education credit certification, please leave your email in the chat and we will make sure to get those to you. This presentation discusses the basics of the Federal Historic Preservation tax incentives, the application process, and some of the common concerns in planning successful rehabilitation projects. So, rehabilitation is the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. The tax incentives are a rehabilitation, not a restoration program. Rehabilitation, as I said, is the act or the process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. We understand and appreciate that in order for historic properties to remain viable for today and future use, that change has to happen. But it's how we make those changes while still having the building communicate its story and significance that matters. The National Park Service administers the program in partnership with the state historic preservation offices and the International Revenue Service. Projects can be of all sizes, from this rental duplex to this very large and complex multi-use residential, hotel, commercial, restaurant. Like I said, tax credit projects don't have to be large to be successful and to have a positive impact on a community. 60% of the projects that receive certification each year cost less than $1 million. Tax projects also produce positive collateral benefits, such as generating new tax revenues and creating jobs. So, the tax incentives program is a three-part review and approval process. Also, this is an ask for permission program, not an ask for forgiveness program. The Part 1 describes the building's significance as well as its appearance and condition prior to the start of rehabilitation. If your building is already individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places, you will not need this part. But if you are listed as a contributing resource to a previously listed historic district or a building that is not yet listed in the National Register of Historic Places, you will need this part. The Part 2 is a description of the proposed rehabilitation work, and every project needs this. And the Part 3 is the certification that the work has been completed according to the approved scope of work and that it meets the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. Please note that the NPS recently issued new forms. The new forms will have a revision date of 6-2023 in the upper left-hand corner. If you submit an old form, I will bounce it back to you to put it on the current form. NPS will not accept any old forms, so make sure you are filling out the correct form before you submit. So, how does the process work? The application process also has 3 steps. The applicant or consultant completes the entire application. We can provide guidance on preparing the application and on rehabilitation treatments if necessary. Additionally, we can meet the applicant and/or consultant at the building for a site visit if requested. The applicant or consultant submits the application and supporting documentation to the State Historic Preservation Office. We need one hard copy for our state file and one digital copy submitted through our online portal for the National Park Service. We will notify the project contact that we received the submittal, and then we have 30 calendar days from the day we received the application to complete the review. If the application must be placed on hold for additional information, the review clock begins once we receive the additional information. We try not to take the full 30 days, it just depends on the caseload. After completing our review, and if we have no concerns about the state of the application, we forward the application to the National Park Service with our recommendation. Please keep in mind that the National Park Service makes the final decisions on all applications and notifies the applicant. The Park Service also has 30 calendar days to review the application once the application is complete, and they are using their full 30 days. Again, if the application must be placed on hold for additional information, the review clock begins again once they receive the additional information. So, the Part 1 is used to determine if the building is eligible to be a certified historic structure. In addition to being income producing, eligible buildings are individually listed in the National Register or contribute to a National Register historic district and retain sufficient integrity of materials to be a historic building. A facade is not eligible for the tax credits, and a building must be a building. Unfortunately, grain elevators and silos are considered structures, not buildings, and therefore do not qualify. In the Part 1, the applicant describes the building's physical appearance and its historic significance. For buildings that are not yet listed in the National Register of Historic Places but would like to apply for the tax incentives program, the National Register process and the tax credit project can be undertaken concurrently. The building just has to be listed in the National Register before the tax credit project is complete and the building put into service. You will work with our National Register of Historic Places program coordinator to get the building listed. Applicants should be aware of several issues that can arise at the Part 1 stage of the application process. If a building is covered with a non-historic covering, that covering must be removed to enable the Park Service to determine whether the building retains its historic facade. For example, if an early 20th century commercial building is covered with a 1960s metal windowless front, the 1960s material must be removed to determine whether its installation caused damage to the original facade. If this is not done before the Part 1 is reviewed by the SHPO and MPS, the application will be placed on hold until the covering is removed and photos of the original facade are submitted for review. Some historic properties contain multiple buildings that were functionally related historically to serve an overall purpose, such as a mill complex or a farmstead. Together, the buildings in these properties are considered to be one single property for review purposes. The Part 2 is where the applicant or consultant describes the proposed rehabilitation work for the entire project. These are some keys to a successful rehabilitation project. Contact the SHPO early in the planning process for advice both on preparing a complete application and on rehabilitation treatments. Submit a complete application to the SHPO well before work begins. The application needs to include good, clear photos of the entire property, buildings, and site before work begins, and a narrative describing the full scope of work. Applicants are strongly advised not to begin work until the Part 2 application has been approved by the National Park Service. Proceeding with work can lead to problems that we will discuss later. Please keep in mind that the SHPO's recommendation is just that, a recommendation. NPS makes the actual approvals on all proposed work and applications. Have a clear understanding of the character defining elements of the building and the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. These are the keys to determining whether changes can and cannot be made to accommodate the new use. Follow through with the work as approved and submit project amendments for any changes after approved work begins. Most projects change somewhat during the construction phase, so don't worry, we have an application for that. Changes are expected and are not a problem, but failure to submit amendments and receive approval for the changes can lead to work that does not meet the standards. Be or have an informed owner. A well-informed owner is the best asset a project can have, as they will be able to identify problems and ask for help from the SHPO and the Park Service so that problems can be solved before they are irreversible. For consultants, a well-informed owner will better understand why they have to do the things they have to or why they're not able to do some of the things that they want to. Remember, this is a tax incentive to follow the process and standards, not a right. Technically, a property or project owner should be able to complete the application for a small to medium-sized project. But for large or complicated projects, owners may want to hire an experienced team. Good members of the team would be an architect, a preservation consultant, an accountant, or an attorney. The owner must take responsibility to ensure good communication among all the team members. There are also some of the most common pitfalls that derail rehabilitation projects. Proceeding with rehabilitation work before receiving the Part 2 approval is the biggest pitfall. If the applicant has done work that does not meet the standards, and if no remedial work can undo the problematic work, the rehabilitation project will not be approved. Refusing to negotiate project changes in response to guidance provided by the SHPO or NPS is another pitfall. During their reviews, these offices may identify work that does not meet the standards and may make recommendations for modifications that will meet the standards. Applicants who are unwilling to explore changes may not receive approval of their projects. A final and unfortunately too common pitfall is assuming that local review undertaken and approved receives equal approval of the Part 2 application. It does not. Again, and I cannot reiterate this enough, just because SHPO or the city says one thing doesn't mean that NPS is going to agree with it, and they have the ultimate authority in what is appropriate and approved and what is not. Each year, approximately 2 to 4% of the over 1,000 projects submitted for review do not meet the standards and are denied certification of rehabilitation. There's a strong correlation among the keys to a successful project, the pitfalls that derail successful projects, and the causes for denial of certification. The first is insufficient pre rehab photographic documentation. Without pre rehab documentation, the SHPO and MPS cannot evaluate the proposed work and therefore cannot approve the project. It'll take as many photos as it takes to adequately show what the property looks like. A second leading cause of denial is work that is already completed that does not meet the standards. As previously mentioned, the Park Service consistently encourages applicants to not begin work until the Part 2 has been approved. Another common cause of denial is that the new use is too intense for building and site. While the new use itself may be reasonable, it may be too intense for the historic property. As an exaggerated example, converting a row house into 3 apartments might be a program that meets the standards, but turning the same row house into 7 apartments likely would not. It is not the use, but the intensity of the use and the level of changes it causes that leads the project to not meet the standards. In terms of specific rehabilitation treatments, substantial interior demolition is the leading cause of denial of certification of rehabilitation. This is often related to the intensity of the program. Converting a building into 3 apartments will be less intrusive than converting it to 7. The last part of the application is the Part 3, or the certification of completed work, which is issued after all work is completed, or as I like to refer to it as the "Look what a great job we did" application. If the building or the historic district is not yet listed in the National Register, certification is not final until listing is complete. If any additional work is undertaken within 5 years after the final certification, that work must be reviewed by SHPO and Park Service and must meet the standards for rehabilitation. So, what are the standards for rehabilitation? The Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Rehabilitation is the set of guiding principles used when reviewing a historic rehabilitation project. They apply to all buildings of all types, sizes, uses, and materials. They apply to the exteriors and the interiors. They extend to the building site and environment, landscape, and attached, adjacent, and related new construction, and all 10 standards must be met. The 10 standards are based on 3 basic principles. 1. To retain and repair historic materials, features, and spaces. To retain the building's historic character, even if the use changes. And to design compatible reversible additions and alterations. To meet the standards, the rehabilitation work must retain distinctive features and craftsmanship. I think we all can agree that this building wouldn't be the same if it was anything but a public gathering space due to the overall volume and sheer level of detail in the features. Historically, this was the main banking lobby for the First National Bank and Trust Company building in downtown Oklahoma City. It is now a dining room, bar, and lounge as part of the recently completed multi-use rehabilitation. Repair rather than replace, and if you have to replace, replace to match. It is also important to repair historic features and fabric rather than replace them. And when something is too deteriorated to be repaired, you replace it to match. In this rehabilitation, the wood siding and shingles are being repaired. Sections of the material that are too deteriorated to be repaired are being replaced to match. For wood, it is important that the replacement material also be wood due to the expansion and contraction of the material. If you were to use a synthetic material, it would not have the same qualities and may damage the historic materials. Many of the historic features and character of the former pachyderm building at the Oklahoma City Zoo were retained in the rehabilitation that converted it from a house for large pachyderms, elephants, rhinos, and hippos, to an event space and small animal exhibits. The success of this project also illustrates the fact that unusual and difficult to reuse buildings have successfully been rehabilitated using the tax incentives. Many rehabilitation treatments are common across building types and must be planned carefully in order to ensure a successful rehabilitation project. On the exterior, windows and other openings are a big deal in helping to preserve the overall historic look of the property. A window with divided lights looks a lot different than a fixed window with just one large light. On the interior, the spaces that the general public historically had access to, are the significant spaces that need to be retained. New construction, new additions, or rooftop additions on the historic building must be subordinate to the historic building and designed in a compatible yet differentiated way. Windows are a character defining feature of most historic buildings. Original or historic windows should be repaired. Generally, windows must be deteriorated beyond repair in order to receive approval to replace them. When windows are deteriorated beyond repair, they must be replaced to match. Replacement windows must match the appearance, size, design, proportions, and profiles of the existing windows, must fit the openings properly, must be in the same plane as the historic windows, and must be compatible with the historic building. Here, only the wood sash was replaced with a matching new wood sash. The wood window frame was retained. Overall, the depth, profile, and shadow lines of the original window remain. Changes to primary elevations should be minimized. For example, installing new features such as balconies on primary elevations changes the character of a historic building and does not meet the standards. A rehabilitation proposal needs to accommodate changes for the new use and retain historic floor plans, corridors, and features. As previously mentioned, extensive demolition of interior elements is one of the leading causes for denial of rehabilitation projects. All the historic corridor and partition walls have been removed in this building. The support beams remain to mark the former locations of the historic corridors. These two before and after rehabilitation examples illustrate the preservation of corridors and historic features. The corridors have been retained along with their features and finishes, wainscoting, and door surrounds and transoms. Corridors that have been finished historically should remain finished. Mechanicals should not be exposed as they are in the photograph on the left. Boxing in mechanicals in certain areas is one option to install new mechanicals while retaining the historic ceiling height as shown on the right. Another option is to place the new mechanical systems in utilitarian areas as shown in this drawing. The new soffit for mechanicals is above the transom head on the room side of the corridor wall. New mechanicals should never cross the heads of windows. Existing wall penetrations should be used where possible in order to avoid destruction of historic materials. This creative way to retain the original multi-light classroom doors in a former school while providing the required fire separation. A new door has been installed behind the multi-light door. When residents open the solid doors in their units, the original door acts as screen doors. Historic wall surfaces should be preserved in a rehabilitation. Historically finished spaces must remain finished spaces. Their wall surfaces should be repaired or replaced in kind where they are deteriorated to the point that they cannot be repaired. For example, the finished space on the left has been deconstructed to look like a warehouse. In the upper right, the plaster has been partially removed to create a wall feature and to highlight a fireplace mantle. The exposed brick and deconstructed interior look may be trendy, but they do not meet the standards. In the same manner, historically exposed brick surfaces, such as found in real loft buildings or industrial buildings, should be left bare. Historic features and finishes uncovered during rehabilitation work should also be preserved. Before rehabilitation, the finishes in the dining room of the Screven Hotel in Oklahoma City appeared to date from the mid to late 20th century and to lack any historic significance. Removal of these non significant elements revealed the early 20th century original mosaic tile, which was restored. Sometimes code challenges threaten interior features. Here, adding a simple new top railing enabled the preservation of the historic stair without changing its character. Another common code challenge is open stairs. Many localities will grant waivers to retain open stairs and achieve fire rating by doing a combination of treatments. One successful option is a glazed wall that retains the visual connection of the staircase and the corridor and satisfies code requirements. The volume of a space or room is as important as the physical details as it alludes to the overall importance of the space and its use and ought to remain. Bisecting the space horizontally by building a floor that cuts across the windows does not meet the standards. However, Carefully placing a mezzanine in the center of a large space retains the historic open character and appearance of the space and does meet the standards. New construction, including new additions and rooftop additions, is the third rehabilitation concern. New construction must preserve the historic character of and be compatible with the historic building. Here, the new construction reads as a separate building along an urban street, and it is separated from the historic building with a new glass connector that clearly differentiates the old from the new. To meet the standards, additions must be compatible with the historic building's massing, size, scale, and architectural features, and must be differentiated from the historic building to preserve its character. The addition, shown here, which duplicates the historic house, does not meet the standards. A rooftop addition must not alter the historic appearance and character of a building. The rooftop additions on this brewery on the left and office building on the right change the distinctive profiles of the buildings and therefore do not meet the standards. A rooftop addition must not alter the historic appearance and character of a building. The rooftop addition, so in contrast, the rooftop additions on these two buildings have been set back in such a way to make them almost invisible when you're seeing the building from the street. And typically, buildings that are of at least 4 stories in height can accommodate um, rooftop additions with little to no, challenges. For more detailed and guided information about the National Park Service's tax incentives and the National Park Service Technical Preservation Services, you can find them on their websites, which are listed here. All right. So now that we kind of have an idea of what the process looks like and what we're kind of looking for when we're making our determinations, let's look at what the historic preservation tax credit actually is. It was created in 1976 originally. It was revised by the Tax Reform Act of 1986, and it introduced the 20% tax credit for certified rehabilitation of certified historic structures and a 10% for non-historic structures that were built before 1936. This was again revised by the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, which states that the 20% must be taken at 4% over 5 years for the recapture period, and it repealed the 10% credit. So here are some national and state statistics. And this is as of fiscal year 2022. Nationally, it has provided almost $123 billion in investments since its inception, has had over um, 48,000 projects, created 3 million plus jobs. And for fiscal year 2022, 858 projects were completed. And then it has generated $6.5 billion in private investment. For the state, we've had a little bit less than that because we're just one state, but I think our numbers are pretty good for a state of our size. Every year, the National Park Service issues an annual report for the previous fiscal year that gives an overview of the impact that Historic Preservation Tax Incentives program has made nationally and by state. And then they break down the overall numbers state by state, and here are our numbers. From 2022's annual report. In Oklahoma, we had the study done a few years ago. We probably need to redo it, but for every dollar awarded in historic tax credits, it spurs just over, just under $11.50 in economic activity. The Oklahoma Treasury receives more than 50% of the money back before the credit is awarded. And building rehabilitation produces more jobs than oil and gas well drilling. So, what is a tax credit? It is a deduction or a lowering of the income subject to taxation. It is a credit, which is a lowering of the tax owed dollar for dollar. And this one is a 20% credit, so 20% of the qualified costs spent in a certified rehabilitation of a certified historic building is that calculation. And again, it repealed the 10% credit, but it did offer 10% of the qualified costs spent to rehab a non-historic building that was built before 1936. So, what is a certified historic structure? A certified historic structure is a building that is listed individually in the National Register of Historic Places, or a building that is located in a registered historic district and certified by the Park Service as contributing to the historic significance of that district. So again, if you fall under any of these either of these two categories, then you do not need a Part 1. If you are not one of these two categories, you will need a Part 1 in order to make that determination. So, a substantial rehabilitation. A substantial rehabilitation means that the rehabilitation expenditures must exceed $5,000 or the adjusted basis. And the adjusted basis is this formula: purchase price of the property minus the cost of the land plus the cost of improvements already made minus depreciation already taken. Once the substantial test is met, all qualified expenditures, including those incurred outside of the measuring period, qualify for the credit. For any specifics about this, that's where a knowledgeable and qualified tax professional will come in handy. I am not a tax professional. I can only give you examples of that I've come in contact with through my experience, but I'm not a tax professional. For actual tax questions, please consult a CPA or the IRS. And I have, so if you have very specific questions about what is what, if you're going to qualify, what, I we can work with you to figure out, to get the answer to those questions. Um, but it's not necessarily, it may not be me. So who does what? So I use these acronyms a lot with them around, but SHPO is the State Historic Preservation Office, which is where I work. NPS, or the National Park Service, is um, the ultimate authority in what work gets approved and not. And the IRS is the one who actually issues the tax credits. Once they get the thumbs up from NPS, they will be the ones to actually give you the credit. And the SHPO is we are the in-state liaison between the National Park Service and the applicant. So for the SHPO, we are the first point of contact. We provide the forms and program information. We maintain records of all National Register buildings and historic districts within the state. We assist those pursuing nomination of a property to the National Register. We provide technical assistance on all of our programs. We advise the owners on applications. We make site visits to assist owners and applicants and consultants, and we make certification recommendations to the Park Service. The National Park Service reviews all applications for conformance to the standards. They issue all certification decisions, approvals, and denials. They transmit copies of the decisions to the IRS. They develop and publish program regulations, standards, applications, and information. So here in Oklahoma, we follow the federal process for the tax incentives program. So once you qualify for the 20% federal, you automatically qualify for additional 20% at the state level for a grand total of 40% back in tax credits that you'll take over 5 years. And we use the same forms that NPS issues. So we do not have a separate form for our state credit. The IRS publishes regulations of procedural and legal matters concerning the 20% credit. They answer inquiries concerning legal and financial aspects of the program, and they ensure that only those eligible for the credits utilize them. The 20% credit, again, it's the 3-part review and approval process. The application process is the certification of rehabilitation work must be documented in the Part 2 description of rehabilitation. Seek advice before you begin work. And after the work is complete, the owner or the applicant submits the Part 3, and only a completed project that meets the standards for rehabilitation is approved as a certified rehabilitation and therefore is awarded tax credits. So how do you do that? Owners of buildings within historic districts must complete a Part 1, as we said, and owners of buildings individually listed on the National Register and are already certified. Part 1 of the HPCA so the Part 1 application is not required, and I will put this caveat 99.9% of the time. The other 0.1% is when there is an additional building on the property that was not discussed in the National Register of Historic Places nomination. So some other so in this situation, NPS might ask for a Part 1 to clarify something with the property to make sure that it is eligible as a whole. So National Register listing, Part 1 of the Part 1 application is completed and used to request a preliminary determination of significance or eligibility or listing. The building or property must be added to the National Register or to a National Register listed district to complete the tax credit process. So, is the building not yet listed in the National Register? Don't worry, this can be done concurrently. A draft National Register nomination must be submitted with the Part 1, and the information in the Part 1 form must match the nomination. This can literally be a copy and paste. Again, the Part 1 records the current physical description of the building with the dates of construction and any alterations. It records the historic significance of the building, and it should be the same information as in the draft nomination. Like I said earlier, we got a new form in August of last year with the submittal change. Make sure you are using the most up-to-date form, as any old forms will not be accepted by Park Service. The Part 2 records the building and rehabilitation project data, records anticipated costs of the project, and it documents the itemized list of all alterations or changes that are being made as part of the proposed project or scope of work. A certified rehabilitation is a rehabilitation of a certified historic structure that is approved by the National Park Service as being consistent with the historic character of the property and, where applicable, the district in which it is located. So for IRS requirements, the building must be depreciable, which means it is used in a trade, business, or held for the production of income. And the rehabilitation must be substantial. It may be phased construction, which provides a 60-month measuring period, must have a set of plans and specifications for each phase, and it's reasonably, and something that is reasonably expected that all phases of rehabilitation will be completed. The property must be placed in service. The credit is allowed the first taxable year that the rehabilitated property is placed in service. It must be a certified historic structure at the time that it is placed in service. So the Part 1 must have been filed before the building was placed in service. And tax credits is based off of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or the QREs. So for the Part 2, again, we just got a new form. So make sure you're using the most up-to-date. To help make sure that you have everything you need for the submittal, we have made checklists for both the Part 1 and the Part 2 that are available on our website on the tax credits page. If an aspect of your project needs to change from what was approved in the Part 2, or you need to respond to a condition of of a conditionally approved Part 2, there's an amendment form for that. You will still need to go through the typical SHPO NPS review and approval process. Be sure to include any photos, drawings, and/or product data that is requested in the condition or to support the necessary change of scope of work in the Part 2. And here's the amendment form. The Part 3 documents the final cost of the project. The owner attests that the completed project conforms to approved Part 2 and any amendments. No narrative is required, but photo key and the post-rehab photographs documenting the entire project, including new construction, site work, or any major interior changes must be provided. Please try to duplicate the photos that were submitted with the Part 2 so that we can have a like-for-like comparison of the two conditions. With the Part 3, please try to duplicate the photos and be sure that the photos are labeled properly and keyed to the site and floor plans that depict the post-rehabilitation work. So, how do you get a project certified with ease? Apply as soon as possible, and in any case, before beginning work. Consult with the SHPO. Read information carefully. Submit early in the project planning and design phase, and wait to get approval in writing before beginning work. Photograph the building and property inside and outside before and after the project. Again, it'll take as many photos as it takes. Read and follow the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation and the guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings. After application is filed, notify the SHPO of any changes in the project. The most recapture of the credit. The owner must hold the property for 5 years after completing rehabilitation, or you have to pay back the credit. This is not for flippers. If a building is sold within 1 year, then 100% of the credit is paid back. Sold between 1 and 5 years, 20% per year. NPS and SHPO may inspect the property at any time during that 5-year period. And NPS may revoke credit for any work not done in accordance with the Historic Preservation Certification application. Revocation for additional work done in 5 years and not improved, the NPS notifies the IRS of such revocations. The most common trigger for recapture is foreclosure. And again, this is not a program for flippers. Going back to depreciation, a rehabilitated property is depreciated using the straight line method. It is 27.5 years for residential property and 39 years for non-residential property. And depreciable basis of rehabilitated building is reduced by the full amount of the tax credit claimed. And again, we don't have the 10% anymore. Here are the websites again for both the NPS websites. On August 15th of 2023, the National Park Service started making all historic preservation certification applications submitted to their office electronic. Please make sure that you are following NPS's directions for file formatting and naming conventions, which can be found on their website. As such, we have set up an online submittal portal to collect those digital files, instructions for which are on the portal page at this web address. Additionally, since our office is not yet set up for online submission only, a hard copy will still be required for submission to the Oklahoma SHPO. Please note that the 30-day review period begins the day the online submittal is received or the hard copy submission is received, whichever comes first. And here is my contact information should you need it. And with that, I will open it up to questions.